All right. So the next couple sections were so we talked a lot about the last couple of sections about all the different ways that we've kind of whitewashed our history in this country. Not all of them, but just some of the bigger ones. But next couple of sections, we're going to focus on efforts throughout the last century to, I don't know if this is a real word, but I use it a lot, to unwhitewash our history, to kind of undo the whitewashing that's been happening through the lost cause, through colonialism, through Eurocentric philosophies and educational systems. So this top-down approach that's been kind of forced on this country for since the beginning. Now, but in the last century, there's been different efforts to kind of open that up and to show perspectives and histories from a variety of different people, and from bottom-up perspectives, and to actually even critically analyze these histories and how they play out in their legacy. So the next couple sections, we're going to highlight some of this with the start of the birth of the I say the written U.S. Black history. Black history, I mean, it is, Black history has been around for a long time, but just recent, the actual what we consider the written Black history, or what we consider Black History Month and things like that in this country is a somewhat recent phenomenon, at least in the past century. I really like this button picture. It says Black history equals American history, and that's really important to do, because we oftentimes with history, different historical perspectives, we compartmentalize them, and we kind of separate them and disconnect them. We have European history, African history, American history, Black history, women's history. And by like teaching them as separately, we're ultimately disconnecting the relationship between them, or we're disconnecting the legacies of them, and how European history affects, and colonial history affects our realities today, and affects Black history. So one way to challenge that is to kind of instead of having stopping when you're teaching Black History Month, instead of stopping it, normal history, but instead incorporate it, because all of this is one history. All of it, particularly around a colonial history, that's happened over the last like 400 years. So it's important to understand that all these things are related, and then they work together, and they react together, and they help create the legacy that we're living today. So it's important for us not to separate them apart, but actually to create ultimately to create a history that is inclusive of all different historical perspectives. But until then, it's also important to have things like Black History Month, because until our educational system is still very much Eurocentric, and still needs to have active, intentional interventions, such as Black History Month. But yeah, we'll start off talking a little bit about. I wanted to start off with this passage from James Baldwin. He wrote this really great article called "Talk to the Teachers" in 1963. Is essentially like what he wanted teachers to be teaching Black students. At this time, particularly in the middle of the civil rights movement. It's a really long article, but it's really well worth the article. I definitely recommend reading all of it. But I just highlighted 4 real quick paragraphs. To start off, it says, it is not really a Negro revolution that is upsetting the country. He's talking about the civil rights movement in the 60s. What is upsetting the country is a sense of its own identity. If, for example, one managed to change the curriculum in all the schools so that Negroes learn more about themselves and their real contributions to this culture, you would be liberating not only Negroes, you'd be liberating white people who know nothing about their own history. I underlined that because that's going to be a central theme of what we're going to be talking about throughout this section. That Black history isn't just for Black people, but it's for our own. It's for us to understand our own history. And the reason is that if you are compelled to lie about one aspect of anyone's history, you must lie about it all. One of the paradoxes of education was that precisely at the point when you begin to develop a conscience, you must find yourself at war with your society. It is your responsibility to change society if you think of yourself as an educated person. And on the basis of the evidence, the moral and political evidence, one is compelled to say that this is a backward society. Now, if I were a teacher in the school or in any Negro school, I was dealing with Negro children, you were in my care only a few hours of every day, and would then return to their homes, into the streets. Children who have their apprehensions of their future, which with every hour grows dimmer and darker, I would try to teach them. I would try to make them know that those streets, those houses, those dangers, those agonies by which they are surrounded are criminal. I would try to make each child know that these things are the result of criminal conspiracy to destroy him. I would teach him that if he intends to be a man, if he must at once decide that he is stronger than this conspiracy, and then he must never make his peace with it, and that one of his weapons for refusing to make his peace with it and for destroying it depends on what he decides he is worth. I would teach him that there are currently very few standards in this country which are worth a man's respect. That is up to him to change these standards for the sake of life and health of the country. I would suggest to him that the popular culture, as represented, for example, on television and in comic books and in movies, is based on fantasies created by very ill people, and we must be aware that these are fantasies that have nothing to do with reality. I would teach him that the press he reads is not as free as it says it is, and that he can do something about that too. I would try to make him know that just as American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it, so is the whole world. So is the world larger, more daring, more beautiful, and more terrible, but principally larger, and that it belongs to him. I would teach him that it doesn't have to be bound by any experiences of any given administration, any given policy, any given morality, that he has the right and the necessity to examine everything. I would suggest to him that that his is living at the moment in an enormous province. America is not the world, and if America is going to be a nation, she must find a way, and this child must help her find a way to use the tremendous potential and tremendous energy which this child represents. If this country does not find a way to use that energy, they will be destroyed by that energy. Yeah, I just really love this passage. It's like perfectly summarizes the importance of not only teaching all of our historical perspectives, not only teaching the hard histories, the bad histories, but helping people understand how they're connected to that history, and how, when he says, I would make them understand that these streets, those houses, those dangers, those agonies are surrounded are criminal. And I think that's one of the best things that we can teach people, is that they're, easier they because if they're living in an oppressive environment, you have to understand that oppression, or you have to give up your self-worth, and understand and believe that you belong in there. So I think that's important for, as part of our education, to understand how we fit into our society. uh, so one of the first, so like I said, Black history is something, Black history has been going on for a long time, but there's a particular person that really, captured that Black history and created into an institution, and that was Carter Godwin Woodson. So Carter Woodson is known as the father of Black History Month. In 1933, he wrote what's called The Miseducation of the Negro. So he analyzed, all the different, textbooks and curriculum that was being, taught to Black children, and he realized just how harmful that was to Black children. So he studied the, so there's a quote that from his book that he writes. Actually, from the intro that Charles Wesley and Thelma Perry wrote into his book, or the intro to The Miseducation of the Negro. But it wrote that the most imperative and crucial element in Woodson's concept of miseducation hinged on the education system's failure to present authentic Negro history in schools, and the bitter knowledge that there was a scarcity of a literature available for such a purpose, because most history books gave little or no space to the Black man's presence in America. Some of them contained casual references to Negroes, but these generally depicted them in menial, subordinate roles, more or less subhuman. Such books stressed their good fortune at having been exposed through slavery to the higher white man's civilization. There were included derogatory statements relating to the primitive, heathenish quality of African background, but nothing denoting skills, abilities, contributions, or potentials to the image of the Blacks in Africa or America. Woodson considered this state of affairs deplorable and an American tragedy, dooming the Negro to a brainwashed acceptance of the inferior role assigned to him by the dominant race, and absorbed by him through his schooling. Moreover, the neglect of Afro-American history and the distortion of the facts concerning Negroes in most history books deprived the Black children and his whole race of heritage, and relegated him to nothingness and nobodiness. So I think about that James Baldwin video we played at the beginning, where he talks about how when he was growing up, there was nothing, written about Black people, and that he was taught that Africa had no history, and the less, said, the better. And that, all the heroes he was taught, all these, white cowboys that were like killing, Native Americans, that he was rooting for. He suddenly realized that, he was rooting for is basically oppressors, and he was the indigenous, that was being hunted by them. So it's, so this is kind of capturing this idea that when, of what it meant to be a Black child growing up in a Eurocentric white supremacist education system, and what that meant to read, basically about how, the assertion that you had no history, and that you should be thankful to be a part of a white man's civilization. So Carter Goodwin Woodson, he wanted to do something about this. So he created what he called the Negro History Week in 1926, which began to he organized Black literature and Black histories, on in this week, and kind of help educate Black students around their history and their culture and their heritage. And eventually, he did this for a long time, and eventually, this week became a month in 1976, and was converted to a Black History Month, and was formally recognized, federally, and it was recognized in all schools nationwide. So that's how we got, in 1976, we got the Black History Month. And although this month, it does, it's very much needed with our Eurocentric education system. It's not the ultimate solution. Ultimate solution is to get to the point where we have an inclusive history, where we don't need to have specific Black history and gender history and indigenous history, where we just have one one history of including everyone's historical perspective. But in reality, we're pretty far away from that. And there's actually been a lot of recent resistance to this, that we'll talk about later, in this section, in this class. So this is great. This was a great thing, but also we need to understand that this is in no way is a solution, or it makes up for our current system. So I want to play a real quick video on just the kind of the history of the Black History Month that I talked about. Sorry about that crazy last second of that video. So Teaching Tolerance is this really great organization that provides lessons for parents and teachers, and curriculum on how to teach more inclusive environments, more social justice lessons, and things like that. And they had this really great article about how to teach and not to teach Black history. This is a small summary. I definitely recommend, especially if you're a teacher, check out this article. It's really great things. But I like this. The do part says incorporate Black history year round, not just in February. Continue learning about Black history and how to teach it. Reinforce to students that Black history is American history. Don't just segregate it. Keep this all. I mean, it's important. Black History Month. Yes, let's spend more time focusing on Black History Month, but this Black history, should be incorporated in all throughout the year. and include political and social context, connect this to the struggles for social justice. And then do not, don't stop your regular curriculum to make this exception that you're, teaching Black history. Don't make this the defining moment that this is a different history away from American history, away from European history, away from African history. This, so that don't compartmentalize this stuff. Continue keep teaching your curriculum, but find ways to incorporate more Black history into your curriculum. Because whatever you're teaching, there are going to be Black histories that can be incorporated, even if you don't know it at the time. You can learn it. And I really like, don't talk about just solely about the feel good. I think we focus mainly on the feel good and the accomplishments, but also look at the struggles and how the struggles and the legacies of the struggles and how they're still playing out today. We're going to talk more about like critical race theory and things like that, and how important it is for us to not just know these histories, but understand how these histories interact with our society. But I definitely recommend, check out this whole article. It's really, really good. It's really good if you do anything for Black History Month. And the last thing I want to end on is James Baldwin trailer for "I Am Not Your Negro." Really amazing, movie that came out. I want to say maybe like 5 years ago. And this just kind of adds to this idea that we're talking about, that Black history is American history. There's a line he says: "The story of the Negro in America is the story of America. It isn't separate." We can't, talk about the creation of this country without talking about what that meant for Black people, what that meant for Indigenous people, for women. And we've been doing it for too long, and we're facing the consequences of that, with how misinformed our general population is, and how easy it is to manipulate our general population into voting for, people pushing and continuing to push these oppressive policies. So I'm just going to play this trailer. I think it does a really great, job kind of summarizing this. But definitely, when you have a chance, check out this whole movie. It's one of the better movies I've ever seen.
If any white man in the world says, "Give me liberty or give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a Black man says exactly the same thing, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him. The story of the Negro in America is the story of America. It is not a critic story. Most of the white Americans I've ever encountered surely have nothing whatever against Negroes. That's really not the question. Really kind of apathy and ignorance. You don't know what's happening on the other side of the wall because you don't want to know. America, I was free only in action. Any kind of action, by any means necessary. They needed us to speak to Khartoum. Now they don't need us anymore. Now they don't need us, they're going to kill us all off. There are days when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. The question you got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, is why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger, I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. You got to find out why. And the future of the country depends on that.
Definitely check out that movie. It's just, like I said, it's such an important perspective that these aren't separate histories. These are all our histories. These are the story of America. So the next section I'm going to talk about is what we call radical historians and new social science scientists. So this is It's like radical historian sounds like like some some crazy radical revolutionary thing, but really, the radical historians are basically historians that teach outside of the typical standard, which our standard today is Eurocentric, top down history. So radical historians are anyone that teaches anything that outside of that European perspective. So indigenous historians, Black historians, Asian historian, American historians, women historians, labor historians, things like that can be considered radical historians. And it's kind of almost like, you know, it's crazy that it has to be even called radical, and not a lot of people use that word as well. I don't know how prolific it is in general academia, but typically that's when people say radical historians, that's what they mean. And this seems like and same with new social scientists. So we're talking about in the 60s there was this movement for more perspectives and histories, for more ethnic studies, for more just getting away from this Eurocentric movement, educational system. So so talk just a little bit about this. So Hello Black, you wrote from 1967 to 1970, Black students and their hundreds of thousands of non-Black allies compelled nearly 1,000 colleges and universities spanning almost every U.S. state to introduce Black studies departments, programs, and courses. The demand for Black studies filtered down into K-12 schools too, where textbooks had presented African Americans to millions of children, both Black and white, as subhuman and capable of achieving culture and happy to servitude, a passive outsider. So there's this whole movement that was really part of the civil rights movement. That it wasn't, the civil rights movement wasn't just about legislation. This was about kind of affecting every aspect of our life, and there was a huge movement towards that. About revise or kind of improving our educational systems, K to 12 schools and even universities. And there was actually all these like protests at universities all in the late 60s all throughout the country, like these like sit-ins and things like that, demanding that their colleges create ethnic studies, Black studies, and like that. And in the 80s, it turned into critical race theory, studies that we'll talk more in the next section. But that movement, I mean, it wasn't just, it just can come out from nowhere. I mean, if you look at any history in any country, there's always, you always have radical historians. You used to always have people trying to, talk about different perspective, whether that's written down, oral history, things like that. So this isn't something new, but there was a bunch of really powerful, radical historians in the early, 20s and 30s and the early 1900s, particularly C.R.L. James, W.D. Du Bois, particularly, when he wrote Black Reconstruction, he was basically, fighting back against this white racist academic world. Carter Goodman Woodson, just talked about the PhD from Harvard that expanded, about Black. You did a lot to advocate for Black studies. So these were some of the, I'm not going to say the first, but these are some of the more powerful people in the early 1900s that academics that were just creating this new version of history, these new perspectives of history, kind of get, pushed away from this Eurocentric perspective. And then that, kind of built onto this whole movement with the civil rights movement, and with all the, the protests at academic worlds and a lot of these professors who were getting involved in the civil rights movements. And you see just in the late 60s, early 70s, you see this explosion of kind of like social sciences, particularly Black studies, ethnic studies, studies around, gender studies, indigenous studies, prison studies. And you just see this explosion throughout the academic world. And you see just an enormous amount, Angela Davis, emerging, Cedric Robinson, Howard Zinn, all these different academic people, these professors that are just starting to, build these new studies and this new research around, essentially just around the different perspectives, historical perspectives of our country. Um, So really powerful, powerful stuff, and that not only it wasn't just contained in academic world, it spread throughout arcade. We saw this as we saw, textbooks, over the next couple of decades start incorporating more perspectives and more bottom up perspectives as well, and more ethnic studies. But unfortunately, again, I mean, as powerful as this movement was. Our school systems are still dominated in a Eurocentric system today. But, we'll talk about Howard Zinn, what a lot of people refer to as a radical historian. He wrote in his article, "What is Radical History?" He says, I am speaking of Black studies, which started around about 1969, began to be adopted with great speed in this nation's universities. These multiplying Black studies programs do not pretend to just introduce another subject for academic inquiry. They have a specific intention of so affecting the consciousness of Black and white people in this country as to diminish for both groups the pervasive American belief in Black inferiority. This radical history and expanded social science movement, which is still growing today, has significantly impacted access to education beyond the Eurocentric perspective, forced the Eurocentric school system to open up to more perspectives, and many would argue it has helped fuel political and social change in the US. Nonetheless, the US school systems is still predominantly structured in the Eurocentric system and is often still a tool to explicitly, implicitly teach non-white inferiority. So, and it's important to understand because, I mean, we see after the, starting around the 70s, particularly with Nixon, we start seeing this backlash towards the academic world. And particularly in that you kind of blossomed, and even in the 80s and 90s, we start seeing like these creations of these right-wing concepts such as like political correctness and like culture wars and cancel culture, and today all these things that they seem like they were created from the left, but actually were created by right-wing institutions, conservative institutions that were all based on wanting to kind of demonize what was happening in the academic world. They wanted to demonize people, instead of, that were trying to study racism and white supremacy and patriarchy, so they want to demonize it, exaggerate them to the point, and demonize them to the point that they're just these annoying people that are trying to take away our freedom of speech. So you see this whole movement really probably starting in the mid 70s until even today, attacking this movement. Even Trump himself, we'll talk about in a little bit, has been attacking the academic institutions, particularly, critical race theory and and critical, and like 1619 project, because they know they know a lot of their power. A lot of reasons why voters will vote for him, even when they do pass policies that hurt these voters. They know that a lot of this, their power lies on, controlling the narrative of this country, controlling the narrative and whitewashing, the past harms, and making white people feel like any kind of racial progress is actually an attack on white people. And this is, and this is really where, the 60s and 70s is really where this right-wing fear of academic institutions and strategies to try to demonize them, starts forming as well. So again, the common theme is when anytime there's progress, there's also a white backlash or whitelash, and we're still seeing that today, with the impacts of, when people say political correctness or cancel culture, that's still the main targets of that is still this new, kind of revolution in our academic world. So Howard Zinn is so he's one of the people that comes out of this movement. He gets, he's a professor in I think Spelman, a college around the Atlanta area during the civil rights movement. He's very active in civil rights, and he's also active in expanding, like ethnic studies and Black studies. Actually, he's a little too radical for his college, and actually gets dismissed and then eventually picked up in Boston University. But in 1980, he writes this book, People's History history of the United States. And obviously, it's not the first book to do this. I mean, there's been a lot of books, a lot of histories, but I think it was one of the first, most comprehensive book where, if you've read it's a book on our history, a very dense book about our history, through the lens of the worker, through the women's right, women, through Black people, through indigenous culture. So it was kind of the complete counter to our normal Eurocentric history. And it's a very powerful book that inspired and kind of helped push a lot of these studies as well. So he gives a speech about mainly why he started writing in this way, and it's a short speech, but I just want to play it real quick. So he's receiving some award, I think, in Paris or someplace like that for this book, and this is his acceptance speech.
I wanted, in writing this book, to awaken a consciousness in my readers of class conflict, of racial injustice, of sexual inequality, and of national arrogance. I also wanted to bring into light the hidden resistance of the people against the power of the establishment. I thought that to omit these acts of resistance, to omit these victories, however limited, by the people of the United States, was to create the idea that power rests only with those who have the guns, who possess the wealth. I wanted to point out that people who seem to have no power, working people, people of color, women, once they organize and protest and create national movements, they have a power that no government can suppress. I don't want to invent victories for people's movements, but to think that history writing must simply recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. And if history is to be creative, if it's to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I think, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I'm supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than in the solid centuries of warfare.
All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is critical race theory, and this is going to be a short summary on critical race theory. There's a lot to critical race theory, and it's kind of, particularly in the last couple of decades, it's expanded to a lot of different areas, from gender studies to post-colonial theories to all different kinds of things. But in a really quick way, short summary of critical race theory. Critical race theory, came about, in the early 1980s from legal scholars and law students, who were analyzing, legal theories and how, legal theories, still, and how, looking at the law and pertaining to things like white supremacy, and how in 1960s, we outlawed all these, racism and discrimination, but yet, with all the civil rights bills, but yet there's still racism and discrimination happening even afterwards. So this is kind of like, taking a step back and looking at like white supremacy and racism and colonialism and things as these systems that we're still dealing with beyond the explicit personal opinions or psychology behind the racism. And it's definitely not, people have been doing this for a long time, but this is a particular kind of a legal legal, or it started out as this like, law framework, but it has since then kind of expanded. But the basic concept is just like kind of understanding racism as a system, and how it's been a part of us, for a long time is kind of the general assumption of critical race theory. But we'll get into a little bit more about it. But I really like this comic, like a concise history of Black-white relations in the U.S. I think this is a great example of critical race theory of like kind of thinking and as racism as these systems of privileges. Where you look at, it starts out this white person, is basically enslaving a Black person and using them to, get up to this, to increase his wealth and create enormous amount of wealth, starting the modern, the Industrial Revolution, modern Europe, America, United States, all created from this, the suffering of Black people and enslavement. And then finally get to the point where you're like, oh, I'm sorry, what I did was wrong. Let me, outlaw slavery. Let me, pass civil rights legislation, things like that. Now everything's, better. But then the Black, but there's still this, this hierarchy. There's still this enormous racial wealth gap. There's still institutions, that were founded by, the white, supremacy. So then the Black people are like, well, can I get me a hand? Which can be reparations, can be affirmative action, anything dealing with like past harm and fixing current institutions based on white supremacy, and the white people on top completely oblivious that they're on top now says, of course not, that would be reverse racism. Look, if I got here myself, why can't you? So this would be like kind of like taking a step back and looking at our history through these like bigger systems of white supremacy and post-colonialism and racism. So I want to start off with John A. Powell, the same, speech, opening speech that he's been giving. It's a long speech, and I've been pulling just little snippets as relate to certain topics. But I really like this, the way he talks about how the perspectives in history and how, for us to understand, for us to understand our own history, we have to understand, what things teach about us. Slavery, he talks about how slavery doesn't, teach people about the people enslaved. It teaches, about the people that enslavers. And so let me just play this video. I think it's a great example of kind of expanding this critical race theory.
I was teaching a class several years ago, and I started off the class in terms of taking indigenous land in the United States. And some of my white students at some point, I forget what the name of the class was. It wasn't a class about Native people. It wasn't a class about indigenous people. So one of the white students raised his hand and he said, Professor Powell, why do we have to study the history of Native Americans? That's not what this course is about. And my response was, we're not. We know nothing about Native Americans. This is the history of the United States. This is your history. This is your origin story. It starts with taking the land of a people and enslaving another people. Now, the land that you take tells you nothing about the people. The people you enslave tells you nothing about those people. It tells you about yourself. It tells you this is your origin story. So really, every white American, every white Brazilian needs to understand slavery, not because you're going to understand Africa, but it's the origin story of Brazil. It's the origin story of the United States. And so part of the turn in terms of understanding anti-Black violence is that anti-Black violence is about both state building. This is how we build a state. This is how we constitute a nation. By first of all, being clear on who's excluded. We draw boundaries, not by just who's in, but who's out, and those who are in, how we exclude and exploit some in favor of others.
All right. So critical race theory, to kind of dive a little bit deeper. Fabiola Cineas says a critical race theory is a framework for grappling with racial power and white supremacy in America. So again, like this isn't the first time people have been analyzing systems of white supremacy and racism, as systems in law. But this is a new framework that's kind of emerging in the 1980s. But starting off in law schools, and particularly by this American law professor, Professor Derek Bell, but then kind of expanding from there into all different kinds of areas. So what it does is examine society and culture as relates to categorizations of race, law, and power. So it looks at how things like legality and racism and white supremacy and the power dynamics and political structures of this country, how they all interact and how they create these systems of oppression and institutionalized racism in this country. So one of the biggest purposes of this is to kind of get past this post-racial narrative that has been forming after the 1960 civil rights bills and the civil rights movement, that all of a sudden a lot of people were pushing this idea that now everything's fixed. We live in a post-racial narrative, so so if anyone's complaining about racial injustice, it's really their own fault, and they're just complaining, or we let's all live in a colorblindness reality, or we live in a meritocracy, or all myths that came to this idea, that were created to kind of ignore this reality that 1960 civil rights bills did not fix the racism and white supremacy in this country. So UCLA School of Public Affairs writes about critical race theory. So CRT recognizes that racism is grained in the fabric and system of American society. The individual racists need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. This is the analytical lens that CTR uses to examining existing power structures. CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. So I think the most important part about this, they say that individual racists need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in a dominant culture. So it's getting past this idea that racism is an explicit thing, that it's done by choice and it's done by bad people, but in reality, this is something, are systems that we're all living under. So, as I was saying, it started in the early 1980s in American law schools, by Professor Derek Bell. And actually, when he moved on, I was reading about like his students actually staged a protest, very similar to like the protests we saw in the 60s and 70s for more academic, studies, ethnic studies, and they raised a protest to continue, studying critical race theory, or to study. I think at the time I think they were calling it critical race legality or something like that. It had more to do about laws at first, and because they were in law student, school. And then some of the early scholars, Patricia Williams, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, a lot of really powerful writers, and emerged, from these, the scholarships to write some really amazing books. But in 2002, over 20 American law students offered critical race theory courses. So we started seeing, since the 80s, is really expanding across the country. And then Fabiola writes again, over time, critical race theory has spread to countless disciplines, from education to political science to sociology. Looked at race in relations to other constructs, gender, class, and sexuality. It has long crossed international borders. Critical race theory is vast, established, and simply cannot be canceled. Critical race theory is decade-long response from people who have been historically shut out in corners of American society. So she really captures that fact that this is really kind of expanded to a lot of different areas, and it could be kind of overwhelming. And there are specific definitions and specific theories around a lot of this, but really the reality is just kind of, it's like the name it sounds. It's just like looking at race critically in this country and how it affects systems and laws and power in this country. So that can be a wide variety of things. Yeah. But So recently, Trump has been attacking. President Trump has been attacking critical race theory, in particular, things like 1619 Project, Howard Zinn, People's History Projects, any kind of anti-racism work, any kind of work that kind of looks at this country and examines, the ingrained racism and white supremacy in this country. And this really started. With Tom Cotton, this Arkansas Republican senator who really started in the 1619 Project that was released last year. We'll talk a little bit more about that in another section, but that was Nicole Hannah Jones, worked with New York Times project, New York Times, to create this project. It was like 11 articles around this idea of redefining how race and slavery created this country, established this country, and the fact that it helped establish this country more of a slaveocracy as opposed to our whitewash narrative of this like great invention of democracy, that really offended Senator Tom Cotton, so he introduced legislation called Saving American History Act that tried to prevent schools from teaching the 1619 curriculum. And to be honest, because I think some of this is exaggerated. No school is teaching nothing but 1619 curriculum. It's additional, it's like supplemental curriculum that can be added to the normal curriculum. So no one's not teaching the normal curriculum and replacing it with 1619 Project. They're supplementing this, their curriculum, their state standard curriculum with the 1619 Project. But that still scares a lot of Republicans, senators like Tom Cotton, who realize that, or if he doesn't realize, maybe he's already so bought into this narrative. But I think he's got to realize at some point that losing the control of our historical narrative is going to cost them voters and going to cost them power. So he tried to pass legislation to outlaw this, prevent schools, but it didn't pass. But that was in July, and then 2 months later, Trump picks up the torch on this issue, and he starts off on September 4th. He issues a ban or he gets his. I forget exactly who. There's a letter on the next slide that they'll say who, but he gets head of one of his agencies to essentially send out this memo banning any kind of diversity education, anti-racism, white privilege, any kind of education for federal workers that center around a better understanding of things like white privilege and white supremacy and racism, particularly around 1619 Project, but also around critical race theory and things like that. So Trump says in one of his speeches around this order, he says, "We want our sons and daughters to know the truth. America is the greatest and most exceptional nation in the history of the world. Our country wasn't built by cancel culture, speech codes, or crushing conformity. We are not a nation of timid spirits." So a lot to unpack in there. I won't waste time unpacking too much. But I think, again, the way I think they have to understand that a lot of their power derives, again, from the, controlling the historical narrative and erasing past harms, and then summarizing, civil rights efforts and equality efforts as this attack onto their white base, onto white voters, onto the way of life, onto American exceptionalism, this idea that this country can do no harm. You've been taught that all your life, and all of a sudden someone's trying to tell you that actually it has caused a lot of harm. There may be some, backlash. So I think they realize that this is important for them to attack. So Trump, and later in September, he announces several different measures. Like he again attacks, he repeatedly gives a speech attacking critical race theory, Howard Zinn, 1619 Project, repeatedly. Calling them un-American, ideological poison. He's blaming all the problems that we have on left-wing indoctrination, because views every issue through he all kinds of un-American, kind of things happening. And he actually signs executive order establishing the 1776 Commission, which I would be really worried about if he got reelected. I think it would be. It would essentially become this indoctrination, this right-wing indoctrination program. But fortunately, he didn't get reelected, and I'm hoping that Biden, especially with his wife being, having a PhD in education is just not going to stand for that. So I don't think it's going to go very more. But the whole point of 1776 was to kind of this play off of a 1619 project to kind of promote patriotic education, to require federal agencies to prioritize, fundings to schools that basically whitewash their history and teach American exceptionalism. So this is okay. So Director of Office of Management and Budget. And so this is the guy that Trump got Russell Vought to send out his memo. This is a full memo, essentially, saying all federal agencies have to stop any kind of what they call divisive anti-American propaganda. All agencies are directed to begin to identify all contracts and other agency spending related to any training on critical race theory, white privilege, or any other training or propaganda effort that teaches or suggests either that the United States is an inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. And so the last line says the divisive, false, and demeaning propaganda of the critical race theory movement is contrary to all that we stand for as Americans. And so you can just see like how scary that it is for Black people, for Indigenous people, for women to understand their actual history, and how much that scares the people, the white population that are in power, how much that can scare people for how much power there is with knowledge. So you can see this like pushback that it's trying, it's just pushing back against these, particularly I want to say the 1619 project was one of the main things that was causing a lot of this. And then it's Andy Borowitz. He wrote this quote, which I think is just a powerful quote. It says, "Stopping Trump is a short-term solution. The long-term solution, and it will be more difficult, is fixing the educational system that has created so many people ignorant enough to vote for Trump." And this isn't like an attack on, like the people that voted for Trump. It's important to understand, like, I mean, those people are real people with real issues and real concerns and real fears. They may have fears that that about providing keeping their paying their house and not being evicted. I mean, have fears about jobs and economy, about the safety of their children. The problem is you have parties like the Republican Party that pushes these racist narratives behind those fears. Oh, you're worried about the economy? That's because all these immigrants are coming over and taking your jobs, not the fact that majority of the wealth in this country is being siphoned up to the top 1%, and there's less and less wealth, and that our wages have remained stagnant since the 70s, despite our productivity, increasing due to neoliberal policies. So never mind all that stuff. It's the poor immigrant people that are attacking you. I remember like someone was telling me about the new Obama book that came out, where he talked about the difference between Trump and Obama, or Democrats and Republicans. And Democrats, point at the rich, or not all the rich, but this upper class that dominates our government as being the problem, and the Republicans point at the poorest and most marginalized people and try to convince people that they're the problem. And that oh, you're worried about the safety of your children, will be scared that Black people are moving into your community. Never mind that we're our disinvestment into Black communities and into poor communities are forcing people into poverty and crime. Don't worry about that. Worry about the fact that a Black person's trying to move in your community. So I mean, it's tied to a lot of these problems, and like I was saying earlier, because of our whitewash history, it's so much easier to sell these racist narratives to people who believe that white people believe that slavery wasn't that bad and Black people are just complaining, or believe that that white people are under attack and have been victims, and just like Confederates were being attacked by these northern aggressors. White people are still being attacked in the same way. So it's easy when you whitewash this history. It's so much easier to push these myths and these narratives that ultimately help people like Trump get elected. So the last thing I'm going to play is, so this is I'm going to play another clip by Howard Zinn on Democracy Now. Democracy Now actually replayed this, this was right before he died, and they replayed this short interview after, Trump, called his work propaganda.
We end today's show with the words of the late historian Howard Zinn. On Thursday, President Trump lashed out at educators who teach about the U.S. history of slavery and racism, announcing a so-called patriotic education plan to combat what he called toxic propaganda in schools. Trump called the teaching of critical race theory a form of child abuse, lashed out at the 1619 Project, the Pulitzer Prize-winning series by the New York Times, which re-examines the legacy of slavery. Trump also directly criticized Howard Zinn during his speech at the National Archives Museum in Washington, D.C.
Left-wing rioting and mayhem are the direct result of decades of left-wing indoctrination in our schools. It's gone on far too long. Our children are instructed from propaganda tracks like those of Howard Zinn that try to make students ashamed of their own history.
So we're turning back now to 2009. Howard Zinn appearing on Democracy Now! Less than a year before he died. He just published Young People's History of the United States. I asked him to respond to a question he'd frequently been asked about his work. Is it right to be so critical of the government's policies of the traditional heroes of the country?
It's true that people have asked that question again and again. Should we tell kids that Columbus, whom they have been told was a great hero, that Columbus mutilated Indians and kidnapped them and killed them in pursuit of gold? Should we tell people that Theodore Roosevelt, who is held up as one of our great presidents, was really a warmonger who loved military exploits and who congratulated an American general who committed a massacre in the Philippines? Should we tell young people that? And I think the answer is we should be honest with young people. We should not deceive them. We should be honest about the history of our country. And we should be not only taking down the traditional heroes like Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, but we should be giving young people an alternate set of heroes. Instead of Theodore Roosevelt, tell them about Mark Twain. Mark Twain everybody learns about as the author of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But when we go to school, we don't learn about Mark Twain as the vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League. We aren't told that Mark Twain denounced Theodore Roosevelt for approving this massacre of the Philippines. No, we want to give young people ideal figures like Helen Keller. And I remember learning about Helen Keller. Everybody learns about Helen Keller. A disabled person who overcame her handicaps and became famous. But people don't learn in school, and young people don't learn in school what we want them to learn when we do books like A Young People's History of the United States, that Helen Keller was a socialist. She was a labor organizer. She refused to cross a picket line that was picketing a theater showing a play about her. And so there are these alternate heroes in American history. There's Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses. They're the heroes of the civil rights movement. There are a lot of people who are obscure, who are not known. We have in this young people's history, we have a young hero who was sitting on the bus and in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to leave the front of the bus. And it was before Rosa Parks. I mean, Rosa Parks is justifiably famous for refusing to leave her seat, and she got arrested. And that was the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, and really the beginning of a great movement in the South. This 15-year-old girl did it first. And so we have a lot of it. We are trying to bring a lot of these obscure people back into the forefront of our attention and inspire young people to say, this is the way to live.
That's Howard Zinn appearing on Democracy Now! In 2009. Howard Zinn was attacked by President Trump on Thursday. The Zinn Education Project criticized Trump's call for patriotic education. The project tweeted, "So what explains the rebellions in 1676, 1680, 1786, and 1831, 1859, and more by Native Americans, enslaved Africans, coal miners, and more? Howard Zinn wasn't alive then," unquote. To see our full interview with Howard Zinn, you can go to democracynow.org, as well as all of our interviews with Howard Zinn over the years.